Hello, everyone. It's so great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. So excited to be back for another week of Better Coffee with Brian. I'm Brian. I'm the Training and Education Manager for Portland Coffee Roasters. And today, what we're going to be doing is talking specifically about some of the things that we do when we brew coffee that impacts the flavor. When I say that, I mean specifically this concept of extraction. If you've been in the industry for a while or you're a big coffee nerd, you've probably heard people talking about coffee extraction at some point. And really, it's just a term that means how are we pulling the flavor out of our roasted coffee into our brewed coffee for us to enjoy and drink. However, I think there's been a lot of mystification or a lot of sort of confusion, maybe. I know I was for a while about what extraction means and how to think about over and under extraction and what does that actually mean about the cup of coffee I'm drinking. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about that and give you all some helpful tips on how to have a better extraction, meaning better flavors in your coffee at home. So thank you so much again for joining. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We're always happy to talk and discuss. This is a live stream, so feel free to engage as much as you feel comfortable. I'm always happy rather to engage. I have a couple of other folks too that are on our team that might be able to answer some questions in the chat as well if I don't see it right away. If you're watching this video on demand style, thank you so much for joining us later. We're happy you can join us too. But if you have questions that aren't addressed in the video, go ahead and leave them in the comments. We're always happy to help there too. Now, all that aside, let's talk extraction. So when I say extraction, one of the things that I think the most about are specifically thinking of the flavors that I want. And I've heard some people say like, oh, that coffee tastes really over extracted or under extracted. And for a long time, I didn't really know how that corresponded to flavor. Well, I'm going to give you a quick cheat sheet on how to think about how coffee extracts. And this is a rule that follows most coffee, right? Generally speaking, anytime you add water and roasted coffee together, hot water and roasted coffee together, it's going to start releasing its flavors in a really consistent manner. And what I mean by that is when you think about your roasted coffee when you think about your brewed coffee, the things that break down first in there are going to be the acids and the salts. So we'll say acids and salts. And we're going to just call that sour. The dreaded sour, right? I've had a lot of folks tell me like, oh, that coffee is just so sour. It's really sour. I think it tastes really kind of intensely sour, right? Well, that's generally because there is acidity in coffee. We talked a little bit about this in some of the previous videos. I know we did on the conversation about roast profiles. But just so you know, generally in coffee, we do want a little bit of acidity. We want a little bit of sourness. Not so much that it blows out our palate, makes us think that we're licking lemons or, grapefruits or whatever. Instead, we're looking for the kind of acidity that causes the coffee to feel more vibrant and maybe less flat. We're looking to have that kind of spark and enjoyment in the coffee through the acidity. Now, if we have too much acidity, it's really unpleasant. When we add water to roasted coffee for the purposes of brewing it, right, the first things that break down out of that coffee tend to be the acids, tend to be those sour compounds. The next thing that tends to break down in the coffee is called the sugars, the sweet part. Again, last week and a few weeks previous, we've talked a lot about how coffee is a roasted seed. And a seed needs energy to eventually turn into a plant. And in coffee seeds, those tend to be either fat, which are these longer forms of energy. They burn and can be converted into energy over time, known as oils, which you see in your cup. And then also sugars, carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are there to help turn that seed into a tree one day. However, when we brew, after the acids break down, the next thing that starts to break down are sugars, or that sweetness. And if you haven't had a super sweet cup of coffee, you're probably not drinking our coffee because our coffees are really sweet. But there is a lot of sweetness in coffee. Now, I should also contextualize, it's not necessarily the sweetness you would get in a dessert, right? This isn't a tiramisu that you're consuming. This is still a coffee. It's still going to have some bitterness too, some acidity, but there still should be a pleasant sweetness to it. Going back, so we have sours break down first, then sugars, which we'll call sweet. And then the last thing that tends to break down are the bitter compounds. And we're going to call that up here. That's actually the plant. When we talk about the bitterness in coffee, some of it is coming from the caffeine, and some of it's actually just coming from it being a roasted plant product. A good way to think about this, right, is if you have a plant product and you're eating it, like think if you're from Portland and you eat a lot of kale like I do, kale has a little bit of bitterness to it. That chlorophyll, that plant material, our body doesn't digest well. And things that we don't digest well tend to taste bitter to us. It's sort of de-incentivizing us from consuming too much of it. And it's true with roasted coffee. In fact, the roasted coffee plant material is going to contribute some of that bitterness. Yeah, Daniel, thank you so much. Daniel was pointing out to the coffee on the table. The 32 Women is a super sweet coffee. That's our seasonal coffee. It's a really fantastic coffee that I would recommend. And I'll talk a little bit more about too towards the end. But if you're looking for a sweet coffee, that's a good one to go with. Now, when we talk about the plant matter that is in roasted coffee, when we talk about that bitterness that's from the plant matter, there's also caffeine, and caffeine is bitter too. This might surprise you, but caffeine is kind of a pesticide when we think about roasted coffee, and we think about the coffee plant rather. The coffee plant having a lot of caffeine, if an insect eats that, eats like the coffee cherry or any of the things that have caffeine on the plant, the insect's nervous system gets overly stimulated and it can cause it to shut down. The funny maybe not the funny thing, if humans have too much caffeine, it is toxic to us at a certain point. Now, I don't just mean like that super jittery feeling, but if you ate or consumed a lot of concentrated caffeine, it could do some damage to your body. You're probably never going to get there drinking coffee, though, unless if you're just mainlining coffee and that's the only thing you're consuming for hours at an end. Oh, great question, Anna. You're wanting to see if there's a lot of different coffees that you'd like to try. Do we offer samples of different roasts? That's a great question. The great thing that we have going right now, if you're interested in trying a couple different roasts out, is we're doing a buy two, get one free on our website. So you can buy 3 different bags of coffee and you get the third one for free. So you're only paying for 2, and the shipping is included on the price you see on our website. So if you want to try getting a few different coffees to try and taste and experiment with, totally feel free to go that route. It's a great way to try out some of the different coffees we have. And then if there's any other kinds of sampling that we're going to come up with in the future, you'll be sure to hear about it here and also on our social media. You can find that on our website, portlandcoffeeroasters.com, or on Instagram or Facebook. So great question, Anna. Going back for a second to some of the bitterness, again, that's the plant matter usually and the caffeine that's contributing a lot of the bitterness to the actual drink we're consuming and coffee. Now, when we think about extraction, we know that the sours break down first, the sweet breaks down second, and last but not least is the bitter over here. Pop, 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 pop. And that is from, we'll just shorten it to plant stuff. The actual roasted coffee parts, the little pieces of roasted coffee that are ending up in our cup. This really simplified version, this really simplified understanding of extraction is going to help a lot. If you always know that coffees are going to taste sour in the beginning when you're brewing, sweet in the middle, and then bitter towards the end, as a general rule of thumb, you can start being able to diagnose whether your coffees are over and under extracted. Because if there's not much pulled out of them and they're still in that early stages, they're going to be predominantly sour, right? If you have something that's really bitter and hollow and kind of tastes like you're chewing old paper, it's probably been over extracted. Now, there are some variables that you can control pretty easily and make adjustments on. They're going to have a big impact on extraction, and we'll talk about those right now. The first one I would want you to think about in terms of thinking about the variables that affect your extraction is the amount of ground coffee you're using relative to the amount of hot water you're using to brew. Now, In the specialty coffee industry, we generally talk about a ratio, and that ratio is usually 1 to 16. And that means for every 1 part of ground coffee, for every 1 gram, for instance, we would use about 16 to 17 grams of water to brew it. Now, this is going to be a good rule of thumb, but there are some coffees that might not taste super great on that ratio. Also, with this is again where I'm going to advocate, if you have a kitchen scale at home, it's one of the easiest ways to improve the quality of your coffee is if you can weigh the amount of ground coffee and then weigh the amount of water you're using to brew. It's going to make a big difference in terms of getting that consistency of flavor and also help you diagnose how to get even more and better flavors out of your coffee. So consider using a scale. If you don't want to, no worries. Try to find another way, another metric that keeps you pretty consistent in understanding the relationship between ground coffee and water to brew. So when we're talking about ratio, one of the things that we can think about how that impacts the potential extraction of the coffee is that we'll go here with the big R for ratio. And I'll add a TIO. So if we're using way too much coffee, if we're using just so much coffee to brew and not enough water, it means that coffee's not going to be able to give up all the flavors it wants. It's not going to get to that sweet point just yet. And so what we need to do potentially is drop that amount down. Now, if we use way too little coffee, if we use almost no coffee at all, ground coffee to brew our beverage, it's going to taste pretty bitter. So all of that is to say, if you're tasting your coffee and it's tasting really sour, there is a good chance you may be using too much coffee. And if it's tasting way too bitter, there's a good chance you're using too much water, H2O. The Goldilocks spot, that spot right in the middle, is when you're hitting a good balance of the amount of roasted coffee to the amount of brew water. Again, 1 to 16 is a good ratio. If I was thinking about brewing, for instance, a 12-ounce cup, generally I'd use about 25 grams to about 400 grams of water. 25 grams coffee, 400 grams of water. And so if I tasted that and it was really, really sour, I might consider changing the amount of coffee and use a little bit less coffee. I might use 24 grams and see if that helps. Something to know though is that when you change the ratio, when you change the amount of ground coffee to the amount of brew water, it will also affect the body. Now, if you've ever heard the term body in describing wine or beer or coffee, so there's some confusion about it. The easiest way to think about body is to think about it as, how does this feel on my palate? How does this feel when I'm drinking my coffee? If it feels really heavy, really thick, really chewy almost, that's got a really heavy body. If it feels really light and watery, almost tea-like, it's got a light body. When you change the ratio that you use to brew, you will impact the body of your coffee. Going back to our little diagram of the sour, sweet, bitter, too much coffee, too much water. If we have too much coffee, it's also going to have a really heavy body. If we have too much water, it's going to have a really light body. So there is, again, that Goldilocks spot, which is why we like our, I'm just going to call this the just right column. Just right. The Goldilocks spot is that spot in between where we're hitting that nice balance between body and flavor. Again, that 1 to 16 ratio is going to help a lot with that. That's usually most coffees are going to taste good at about 1 to 16 to 1 to 17 by weight. Now, outside of ratio, though, there's another key variable to consider that won't have as much of a direct impact on the experience of body in your coffee. And that has to do with the grind setting. And so when I say grind setting, I mean how coarsely or finely ground your roasted coffee is that you're using to brew. Now, when we're brewing coffee in a brewer at home as a pour-over brewer, or if we're using like a drip coffee machine, or even if you have an espresso, for instance, this is true in some cases, right? If you have really coarsely ground coffee, the water is going to want to run through it really quickly, right? It's wanting to push through that bed of coffee really quickly. So there is a relationship between grind and time. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but first let's just talk about grind size on its own and then talk about how it relates to time. So when we're talking about grind, whenever you're grinding coffee, you're actually exposing some more or less surface area on the individual particles. The best way to think about this is if you have, oh yes, absolutely, Anna. The ratio to look at when you're thinking coffee to water is 1 to 16 coffee to water. So 1 part ground coffee for 16 parts water. For a 12-ounce cup, that usually looks like 24 to 26 grams. I usually go 25 to about 200 grams of water. I'll make sure to write that down too, right here. So we'll call this 1 to 16. Right there, and I'll box it. That's a great question, though. It's right here, too. I realized I forgot to change the camera. There we go. Cool. So, grind setting, though. If we think about grind, we think about the size and exposure of those individual coffee particles to the water that's coming in to brew it. If we have 100 really finely ground coffee particles, they're going to have much more surface area than the same amount of coffee that's ground really coarsely, which means water can get in and out really quickly and more efficiently. Because it's more efficient, it is going to make it easier for the coffee to give out its flavors for it to extract. So generally speaking, if our coffee is ground really fine, it will extract faster and more efficiently than if it's ground really coarse. What that means from a flavor perspective is that if we think about grind here, living the Groundhog's Day style grind that I'm sure we're all in right now. That said, when we're thinking about grind, if we're thinking and tasting something that's too bitter, there is a chance that our coffee is ground too fine. On the other hand, if it's really, really sour, there's a strong chance that it is too coarse. Grind too fine, you're bitter. Grind too coarse, you're probably a little sour. If it's just right in the middle, it's going to have that good balance of all three components. With grind, the efficiency of extraction also has a relationship to the quickness with which water goes through. And so what we really want to talk about, though, is brew time. If you're using a French press, your grind setting isn't going to have as much of an impact on your brew time because you're controlling your brew time with that filter and how long you're pouring or how long you're keeping the water in contact with the ground coffee. Now, if you use a pour-over coffee style brewer at home or you use a drip coffee brewer, the grind size is actually controlling how quickly the water goes through the coffee. And so there's a direct relationship, right? In most drip through style brewers, pour over or home drip brewers, or even in our commercial settings, like the large brewers we have in our cafes, the coarser a coffee is ground, the quicker it runs through. Now, the amount of time that water and coffee hang out together has a big impact on the flavor of extraction, right? If a coffee and water hang out together for a really long time, way too long, it's going to start breaking down that steed, breaking down the roasted product, and getting bitter quickly. If a coffee and water hang out for not nearly enough time, they haven't really even had a chance to have their appetizers and main course if they were out on a first date, they just got their first meal and were out, they would be pretty sour about that. And your coffee will be sour if it doesn't have enough time to hang out with its best friend, water. So, when we're thinking about time, the longer that a coffee is there, the more it extracts. The longer coffee and water are together, the more it extracts. The shorter amount of time, the less it extracts. Generally speaking, most brewed coffee, most filter coffee or French press coffee or drip coffee makers should be brewing in between about 2.5 to 5 minutes. Generally speaking, that's a pretty wide window. I usually like to go a little bit smaller. I like 3 to 4 minutes roughly. Personally, that's usually a good range to go in, but you have some ability to modify that, right? So when we think about time, grind time, if we have too little brew time, it's going to be sour. If we have too much, is definitely going to be bitter. So we have 3 key variables that you can think about when you're thinking about how your coffee should taste, right? I'll give you the window of the gist right here, usually 2 minutes and 30 seconds to 5 minutes is a pretty big window of time, but that's a good amount of time for coffee to take to brew. And your grind setting, it's going to be a little bit harder because it's going to have a relationship to this time. So you're probably looking for a similar metric on these, unless if you're using a French press or other style brewer where it's not dependent on gravity or water flowing down through a bed of coffee and away through a filter, right? All that is to say, if we look at this chart, these things are going down pretty much in descending order of importance with how they impact the flavor of your coffee. Ratio is going to have the most impact on the extraction, right? If you change your ratio first and find a good ratio and a good body feeling, that's a good place to stop, right? If the coffee feels good, the body of it feels good, the texture of it feels good, and it doesn't taste aggressively sour or aggressively bitter, maybe a little sour or a little bitter, leave it there and then start adjusting your next variable down, which is this grind piece, right? At that point, you can try adjusting your grind to compensate. So if I have a coffee and the body is good, but it's a little sour, I'm down here now. I've moved past ratio. The body is pretty good, but it's not aggressively sour. I'm down to grind, but it's here. I would then move my grind a little bit finer. I would go finer to get to sweet, right? This is going to have an impact on time if I'm using a drip through brewer. And so that's also probably going to push the time up. And I can diagnose it by saying, oh, not only is it a little sour, I can see that I'm done brewing in about 2 minutes instead of 3. The other thing, if you have a pour over set at home, you can slow your pour down, right? You can slow down the interaction of water hitting that bed of coffee and shoot to sort of elongate the brew time by pulsing at lower intervals for longer. And that'll continue to pull the time out. But time tends to have, that's the variable that I'm honestly the most flexible with. I've had coffees that are brewed really quickly and brewed really over a long period of time that still taste fantastic. But ratio and grind, oh boy, if those aren't right, your coffee's not going to taste as lovely as you would recommend. Anna, great question. What grind do I recommend and how do I determine that? So, easiest way to determine your grind is going to be looking, if you have a drip brewer, is time the amount of time it has to brew. If it's brewing really quickly, it's too coarse. Unfortunately, I can't offer a specific recommendation always for how your grinder should be set. If you have a grinder at home or if you're using a grinder at a store, every grinder is a little different. They're made up of these burrs that effectively just chop up coffee, and depending on how big those burrs are or how fast the motor is that spins them, or even how recently those burrs have been installed, how sharp they are going to impact the grind setting a little bit. Generally, though, more often than not, the grind setting that I think tends to work really well is something that's a little bit around the size of table salt. If your coffee particles are about that size, for most home brewers, for most pour-over brewers, you're in a great place. If you're doing a French press, you're looking for larger pieces. Think more like finishing salts, or what's a non-salt metaphor to think about? I have salt on the mind. Maybe I'm just feeling salty. We'll say finishing salt, larger pieces, or turbinado sugar, maybe bigger than turbinado sugar. On the other end, if you're using an espresso machine, you're looking for something that's much more almost a powdery consistency, like sand. Not powdered sugar consistency. That's what we would consider something for like Turkish coffee. But generally, the good rule of thumb with this is that if you're using a home brewer, you're looking at about a table salt consistency. And then time your brew. See how long it takes to brew. If it takes way too long, it's probably too fine. If it takes way too short, it's probably too coarse, and you can adjust there. Also, trust your palate. You guys probably have amazing palates. Daniel, playground sand, thank you. I appreciate that for the course suggestion. Maybe, I think... Ooh, so Daniel, if you're in the chat, take a look. Daniel's one of my colleagues, and he's offering some good references for the coarseness or fineness of ground coffee particles comparing to sand and not salt. All of that to say, too, I want you to know that your palate is excellent. Don't underrate your palate. And if you taste something and it tastes really sour, that's generally a sign that that's under extracted. And if the body feels good, if the texture of it feels good, and it's not aggressively sour, it's not like licking a lemon, but it's just sort of lightly too sour, then it's a good time to adjust your grind a step finer. If you're going to a cafe, like one of our cafes, we're open right now, by the way. If you're interested and you're in Portland, you can order our coffee through Grubhub. We also have a takeout window. You can buy our coffee in person there, or have it delivered to your home, or through our website. On either of those places, though, you can set your grind setting, and usually they're going to be brought in, you can say, according to your brewer. So if I say, oh, I have a home brewer at home, I'm just brewing on a Mr. Coffee, or I'm brewing as a pour over, they'll grind it for you in a roughly about that right setting. If you are looking for something in a French press or a cold brew style, they'll grind it much coarser. And this is true on our website as well. If you have a grinder at home, it's that trial and error piece a little bit, right? Get your ratio set, have the texture feel good, have the flavors be roughly in the right neighborhood with your ratio within that 1 to 16-ish window, maybe plus or minus 1 to 17 or 1 to 18, or down to 1 to 15, 1 to 14. I've rarely seen coffees taste really good at the far ends of the extremes, but there are some that do. Once you have that ratio set, then just use your palate to dial it in. Trust yourself, trust your flavors that you're experiencing, and make small adjustments in one direction or the other. And that is a great way to think about extraction. So again, big high level thing: sour, salty, sweet, bitter. That's how coffee brews. Most coffees, when they interact with water, they're always going to taste sour first. The very first few driplets of coffee out of your brewer are going to taste pretty intense, pretty sour, pretty salty. The stuff that comes out in the middle of the brew cycle, the middle to middle late period, is some of that sweetness, some of that nice kind of caramelly and fruity sweetness in there. And then the very last things that start breaking down are the actual plant product itself. So you're getting more of the bitterness, more intensity of bitterness. If you have any coffees that you love too, that you feel like you're having a super hard time getting to taste the way that you want, you're having a hard time getting it perfectly nailed, feel free to leave comments in our comment section. You can also, there's a help section, I think, you can, our contact us section on our website that you can send emails to. I know we have one, I believe, for training, that's just training@portlandroasting.com, and you can send it to us, and we'll be happy to help troubleshoot a little bit too. Though the best way you can do it, the fastest way to get a response, is to put it in the comments of this video or chat of this video. Ooh. And how does this affect cold brew? Sometimes you do a cold brew in the morning and you warm it up. That's a great question. One, I want you to know we're going to be doing a video on cold brew in the near future, not next week. Next week we actually have something really special I'll talk about in a moment, but we are going to do some cold brew tutorials and talk a little bit about how to adjust the flavors in cold brew. To your question, how does the extraction affect cold brew? Generally speaking, when we're cold brewing coffee, we're taking the ground coffee and letting it sit in room temperature water for a period of time. As a result of the ratios we're using to brew usually and the length of time, we produce something that's pretty concentrated. If you've ever made cold brew at home and you just drank it straight after brewing it, it might have tasted pretty intense. That's why a lot of people will cut their cold brew with water. When we make it in our professional facilities, we actually brew it as a concentrate and then cut it with equal parts concentrate to water, roughly. We actually have a little tool that we use to test to make sure it's just the strength we want it to be. The extraction of cold brew, though, is a little bit different because it takes place over a longer period of time. I would say with the extraction of cold brew, your ratio is still going to have a big impact and your grind setting is still going to have a big impact, but the time is going to be, again, that variable that is probably the one you're going to mess with the least. I would say try to set a time that you like to brew with that makes sense with your schedule. Usually that's about 12 to 14 hours. I'll set it up the night before, and then in the morning I'll decant it, get my grounds out, and then I have my delicious cold brew. So keeping that consistent, about 12 hours. But if you're tasting your cold brew and it's really intensely sour, that's usually a sign that you're using too much coffee. You can probably cut back on some of the coffee. The ratio is not going to be the same either. It's not a 1 to 16. I want to say On our recipe, we have a recipe that we do by volume, and it's about 1 cup of ground coffee for 4 cups of water, and that produces that nice concentrate. The sourness, though, usually is a sign that you're using too much coffee or your coffee is way too coarse. Now, on the other end, if you're not getting as much sweetness, you're just getting something that's like kind of like chewy and not pleasant and kind of drying and bitter, your grind setting's probably too fine, or you're probably using too little coffee. With that, the best thing to do is to just taste and see. Use a ratio that you like, and then also before adjusting your recipe, try adding a little bit of water to your cold brew to see if by diluting it you're getting more flavor. It's partly because cold brew as a brewing process, at a certain point you reach kind of a critical mass and the coffee stops brewing really. There's just a saturation of coffee compounds and things in the water nearby at a certain point, and it just kind of stops brewing. It just sort of says, no, I'm good. But because it has all this time to break down some of the fats and have a lot of that contact time, it really produces that nice heavy-bodied, rich cold brew that we love. So that's a great question though, Anna. More on cold brew soon. We're going to have a whole session devoted to cold brew next week, though. I want to give you a quick heads up. We're going to be doing an interview with one of our amazing partners that we work with in the coffee business, except it's not coffee, it is tea. So if you have any tea fans in your life, make sure to let them know about our stream next week. We're going to be talking with a tea specialist from the fantastic company Smith Tea. They're a local Portland-based company that is a very storied and exceptional tea company that we're proud to work with. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can adjust some things at home to get more out of your tea, and also talk a little about how a tea company goes about blending teas to make something really unique and special and lovely, even for something that can feel really simple like a house or morning tea blend. So really excited for that. Be here next week. We're excited to host our friends at Smith Tea. And then that is pretty much it for us today. So I want to say thank you again, everyone, for being here today. I really appreciate the great questions. Anna, thank you for your questions. Daniel, thank you for jumping in too. Go ahead and leave comments. Subscribe if you would like the video too if this was helpful. And always remember to stay curious, stay caffeinated, and stay safe out there. Thanks so much, y'all, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week as we talk tea. Bye, y'all.